Is the Robinson R44 a safe helicopter? That's what we're talking about today. In 1993, the R44 came into development. Its first helicopter went onto the production line. Since then, 6,300 of them were built. 6,300. It became the most popular sold helicopter in the world, far outselling any other model of helicopter out there. That's pretty incredible, okay? There's some pretty incredible things that have happened with it. In 1997, Jennifer Murray became the first woman to circumnavigate the world in a helicopter. She did it in a Robinson R44. The helicopter has a useful load of about 750 pounds with a full tank of fuel. Its cruise speed is around 110 knots. It burns about 60 liters or 15 gallons of fuel per hour. Its endurance is about 3 hours, and that gives you about a range of 330 nautical miles, okay? Amazing thing about the helicopters, it's a 4-seat piston helicopter. It's well priced. I would say, I'm not going to call it cheap. Nothing's cheap in helicopters, but it's well priced, and it's affordable to a larger demographic. That's why it was so popular, and that's why it was so widely sold across the world. Okay. We're going to talk about a few different things today. We're going to talk about, I'm going to focus on 3 things because I want to determine whether or not the R44 is a safe helicopter for people to be flying, okay? There's 3 things. Number 1 is the evolution of helicopters. The second one is how people are flying the helicopter, and the third one is who's flying these helicopters, okay? Let's go through and talk about these 3 different things. If I want to talk about the first one being the evolution of helicopters, there's something that's very unfortunate about helicopters, and I think it goes for a lot of technology in general. I think in helicopters it's just more dramatic. We see it more often, it gets more publicized in the news and so forth. And that is when for something to get improved in a helicopter, unfortunately, there typically has to be a negative effect that causes the result, the resultant factor, okay? So typically, there has to be some sort of a failure or an accident, and a lot of times, unfortunately, a fatality before something gets very seriously looked at and said, hey, there's an issue with this design, we need to figure out how to fix this, and then the design gets changed. The example I want to use first is the bladder fuel tanks in the R44, okay? The early design of the helicopter was just with an aluminum fuel tank. You fill up your fuel. Then they started having accidents, and they started analyzing some of these accidents and saying, hey, there's a lot of post-crash fires. So the people are surviving the accident, but then they're trapped inside the helicopter because it's crushed and the doors won't open, and then they're actually burning alive inside the helicopter because they can't get out. And it's horrific, and because of how horrific it is, it started getting looked at very seriously and saying something needs to be done about this, okay? Now this is sort of an industry-wide thing. It started coming out similar times. I think definitely manufacturers that have been around a lot longer started doing it earlier. And that's a bladder fuel tank, okay? So in 2004, I believe it was, in 2014, the bladder fuel tanks on the R44 became mandatory, okay? In 2009, the FAA started suggesting, okay, you should start switching your helicopters over to the bladder fuel tanks. Basically what it is they put a rubber lining or a rubber tank essentially inside of the aluminum tank, and it was impenetrable essentially. So if you had an accident and the fuel tank burst and kind of crushed, that's not going to ignite the fuel because inside of it is this thick rubber bladder, and that's going to protect your fuel, okay? That made a massive difference. Now, if the helicopter was crashing, you're not going to have this post-crash fire. People that are alive inside are going to have the ability to get out of the helicopter and egress the helicopter, and there won't be a post-crash fire, okay? That's evolution. Unfortunately, all helicopters have to go through it. If you look at the Bell 206, for example, a lot of people consider the Bell 206 to be one of the safest helicopters out there in a lot of respects. And the reason for that is it's one of, if you put it in balance, it's basically next to the Robinson R44, it's the next most popular helicopter in the world, in the sense that an incredible amount of them were sold. They started being designed early, I believe in the 50s or 60s, and ever since then, they've had issues with them, and those issues have been resolved. A lot of fatalities have happened, unfortunately, and through the evolution process, these helicopters have been designed and redesigned and redesigned. Little changes and modifications have been made to them, and so now people consider them to be an incredibly safe helicopter because of all these changes that have happened to them. Robinson, in general, when you're looking at the helicopter industry as a whole, is a very new helicopter. They came into existence really in the 90s and late 80s with the R22, like 80, I believe it was 87. And but it's a very new helicopter in relation to most manufacturers. Okay. So their evolution process has started later than most, all right? So using that fuel bladder tank as an example, that's been a major modification now, and now there's not nearly as many post-crash fires. Obviously, there's none due to the, well, none that I know of anyways, due to the fuel tanks rupturing because of the bladders inside, okay? In 2015, there was a horrific accident, high-profile accident in New Zealand. 2 people fatally injured, and it was a big alarm bell sounded basically because of the profile of these people, and so they started taking a really close look at this accident and trying to find out what happened to it, and it was determined that the blades were fatigued, and they determined after the fact that they were fatigued because of the actual crash. But there was a lot of speculation about were those blades fatigued because of a flaw in the design of the blades, and that caused the helicopter to crash, okay? New Zealand went on to ground their entire fleet of 80 helicopters. I believe that's all they had. They grounded 80. I think that was basically all the helicopters they had in the country. Later, Australia followed suit, and they grounded their Robinsons as well, the R44s. And so it led to the FAA in the US to go on this big campaign to figure out what's going on with these helicopters. And all of a sudden the whole world kind of screeches and says, whoa, what's going on? The R44 is an incredibly unsafe helicopter. All of New Zealand and Australia have grounded their Robinsons and basically saying, you know, we can't operate them and so forth. What's going on here, okay? This brings me to my second point, is how these helicopters are being flown, okay? When you look in depth into this accident and this stream, they determined it's the dash, don't want to get this wrong, I believe it's the dash 5 blades replaced by the dash 7 blades. They actually made a modification to it. They came out with a modification that there could be potentially a fatigue point right behind the trim tab, and so they actually came out with a modification to that, okay? Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. If it's the dash 5s, I could ask my brother, and he would know for sure off the top of his head, but I'm forgetting now. Anyways, so what they've determined is, okay, there's possibly a fatigue issue, and basically the result from the FAA came out because of the amount of lashback that they got, or backlash that they got from the entire industry saying, hey, there's something wrong with your helicopter, there's something wrong with your blades, fix it. And so they came out with a new model saying, okay, now it's fixed. When you dig deeper into it, from the research that I've done talking to Robinson, talking to people in New Zealand, that were around when this happened, and then, you know, others in the industry and so forth, what actually has determined to be found was the issue was the way that these helicopters are being flown, okay? There was a reputation in that region, I think in all of New Zealand, that these helicopters were being overutilized beyond the specifications or the capabilities of the helicopter, meaning they were getting loaded over gross, they were being flown beyond their capabilities, beyond their flight characteristics that they were designed for. And when you do that, the helicopter goes beyond what it's designed for. When we were at the Robinson safety course not that long ago, they showed us some really incredible examples of fatigue, metal fatigue. And it's something that's so interesting because it's so subtle. So when metal gets fatigued, you can fatigue it once, you'll never notice it. Do it again, you probably won't notice it. Continue to do it day in and day out, day in and day out. You're overstressing. Even if you're overloading that aircraft 30 pounds beyond its gross weight limit, you're never going to notice that for the first hour, for the first 5 hours, for the first 50 hours. It may take a long time for it to progress, but the metal inside is being fatigued just slowly but surely. And if you were to do testing on the metals, you would be able to see with like a whatever technology they use, that you'd be able to see that there's micro fracturing happening in that metal, okay? there's fatigue going on that you can't see with the human eye. You look at that blade, you take a good, nice, careful analysis of it, it looks perfect, it looks fine. You go flying and all of a sudden that blade fails one day and you go, whoa, there's something terribly wrong with this helicopter. The blade just failed, okay? My second point is you have to look at the way that the aircraft is being flown. This goes for all aircrafts, not just Robinson. Look at the way that the aircraft's being flown to determine whether or not the helicopter is safe, okay? The third thing that I want to talk about is the people that are flying it, okay? The third example we'll look at is the rotor system. Now, don't get me wrong, you guys. I believe just as much as anybody else out there that Robinson should get on the ball. They should just redesign their rotor head, make a 3 or 4 bladed rotor system, which, by the way, I hear might actually be in the works, which would be incredibly exciting for the company. And they should get on the ball and do this. But for now, they've basically said there's nothing wrong with our helicopter. It just needs to be flown within the characteristics that it was designed for. Now, I believe them to a certain extent. Let's explain this a little bit, okay? The helicopter has a 2-bladed, semi-rigid, underslung rotor system. What does that mean, okay? It means, I'm just gonna use just rudimentary stuff here, okay? That means the rotor system looks like this. What does that mean? Right up here is the pivot point or the mounting point of that entire rotor system. And then it looks like this. There's actually a hinge down here. Right here, the blade is being attached, and then that's the root of the blade. And the blade goes out from there, okay? Now you have your rotor mast underneath like this, and the top of the rotor system is actually attached up here, okay? So what happens is when the blades flap back and forth, it's one system, okay? When the blades flap back and forth, they actually teeter like this, okay? That helps it compensate for the center of mass change as the blades cone up like this. So it's a good design in that sense. And so it goes back and forth like this. Here's the issue. When you have a rotor system up on the rotor head that has the ability to do that, if it does this too much, you guys can see the issue. The root of the blade right here has the ability to come in contact with the mast, and that's what we call mast bumping. You guys have heard of this before. It's the leading cause for the fatal accidents in the R44. Actually, that's not a true statement. The wire strikes and inadvertent flying into IMC conditions are the two #1 fatal accidents. The one that everybody talks about is mast bumping, okay? Mast bumping is caused by or led to typically from a low G pushover or some form of a low G pushover situation. Two different types of ways that happens. If you're flying up and over some terrain, you pull the nose up, so cyclic comes back, you pull the nose up, and then you come over the terrain and you push the cyclic hard over, and then the nose dives down and the helicopter's tail comes up. The helicopter becomes unloaded, it becomes low G. That means when you're sitting in the seat, it actually feels like you're floating. Your stomach comes up like this, and you feel like you're light in your seat. That's considered a low G. If you feel really heavy in your seat, that's a high G situation, okay? So, when you do a pushover like that, it's low G, the whole helicopter gets light, and that rotor system now has the ability to flap like this, okay? The other thing that's happening is as that tail rotor comes up and over the rotor disc, so the rotor disc is right here, that tail rotor comes up and over it, the authority of that tail rotor pushes the helicopter over to the right. So now the helicopter is going to do a hard roll over to the right. The blades are spinning around like this, counterclockwise. When the pilot is flying and the helicopter all of a sudden whips to the right, what are they going to do to try and fix it? They're going to shove that cyclic hard over to the left. That's going to cause the left blade pitch to decrease. The reactant of that is going to happen 90 degrees later, and because of that rotor disc having the ability to flap so hard, that rotor disc is going to flap really hard and it's going to chop off your tail boom. The other thing that'll happen at around the same time is the root of the blade will bump the mast and the mast will come off. Okay, it's a catastrophic in-flight failure. The whole helicopter comes apart. It's caused by a pilot overcorrecting when they come over some terrain, or it could be in just mid-air flight as well, or in a high turbulent situation, okay? So if you're flying in a situation where you're getting lots of turbulence, you're getting pushed up and down and left and right, and all of a sudden the helicopter gets pushed up, the nose gets pushed up, and the pilot shoves the cyclic forward, or any other combination, and the helicopter gets into a low G situation, that again is where that mast could bump, and that's where the helicopter could come apart, okay? This is really important to understand because this boils down to what I'm talking about for my third point is who's flying these helicopters, okay? I'm not gonna blame it only on the pilot, but I think the pilot has a really, really big part to play in this, okay? Because of the fact that it's an affordable helicopter and it's so massively sold across the world, you have a variety of people that are flying them, and a lot of times it's either private pilots who fly 10, 20, 50 hours a year, maybe once or twice a month, which is not very much. Or you have student pilots. It's being used in a flight school, and student pilots are going out on some cross country, some time building, some solo flights, whatever happens to be, low hour experienced pilots, okay? These are the two demographics that are very, very heavily using these helicopters, okay? So when you look at the statistics of the accidents that are happening, a lot of the time, these fatal accidents are happening by these categories of people. Not always, though. There are exceptions where high-time pilots are having these issues as well. And I feel like it's also a training thing, okay? Now, I've been in an R44, actually I've been in an R66 as well, in some pretty severe turbulence. I've been in some pretty heavy, moderate turbulence. I've been in an R44 once and an R66 once in what I would consider to be severe turbulence, okay? Now, I think there's two reasons why I'm here. Number one is there was angels holding the helicopter while I was flying. That's number one. Number two is that I didn't move those controls. Now, I've done a whole video about this before of how to fly the helicopter in turbulence, and the main thing is to just lock your hands and feet on those controls, and if it bumps you around, you just make sure that you do not move those controls, because what happens is when the helicopter becomes low G, if you're moving that control around, the cyclic control around, you're exaggerating, exasperating whatever it's trying to do. So the helicopter's getting rocked to the right, and you flick the rotor system the opposite direction, and you're gonna mass bump. If you can hold that cyclic control and your collective control and everything as steady as possible, you're gonna just let that helicopter ride through the turbulence, and it's not gonna have the ability to mass bump, okay? I've been in some pretty severe stuff, and I haven't had any mass bumping from it, okay? Okay, so who's flying the helicopter, I think is very important. The training that the people are getting that are flying these helicopters is incredibly important. I think that they need to get really careful training on the risks and the dangers of these helicopters and how they need to be flown so that you can avoid some of these really critical things, okay? I'm gonna sum this up and the video is gonna be over, all right, you guys? I think you've listened to all my things that I've talked about. Am I going pro or con on the safety of the R44? I'm in the middle, and what I'm saying is I think it's a very safe helicopter in the right hands of the right people in the right conditions, okay? You put those three things together and you've got yourself a really great, safe helicopter. It's efficient, it's fast, there's lots of room for storage. It's a great helicopter all around, but, and there's a big but, there's some big flaws, and I've talked about those big flaws in this video. I've explained them, I hope, in depth enough for you guys. And I think if people aren't taking those things into consideration, if they're not being careful enough with the things that I've talked about, yes, there's going to be more issues to the helicopter. Just manufacturing wise is going to happen. There's going to be things that are going to occur in the helicopter, malfunctions, and that's the nature of any piece of technology, and they will get fixed and it'll get better and better. So, 20 years from now, a Robinson will probably be a lot safer than it is today, okay? But as it is today, as it sits today, it's a very safe helicopter to fly if you're flying it in the right conditions with the right person behind the controls, okay? If you guys are going to be the person behind the controls, you need to ask yourself the questions. Am I prepared for the dangers that this helicopter can lead me to? So am I aware of low G situations? Am I aware of flying in turbulence? Am I aware of what I should do and how I should react if I get into those situations? Because here's the reality, you guys. It's very easy to say, oh, I'm not going to be that person. I'm going to just only fly in nice, calm conditions, and I'm only going to go out when it's blue sky and sunny. That doesn't always happen, okay? I've gone out on many days that felt like a great day, and then you get out somewhere and all of a sudden you get hit with some stuff that you weren't expecting, okay? It's how you react in those situations that matters. So if you're gonna be flying this type of helicopter, be aware of its drawbacks. There's definitely some big drawbacks to it, but I think flown in the right way by the right people and not exceeding any of the limitations that are set out in the flight manual of the aircraft, I think you've got a really safe helicopter on your hands. That's my whole holistic story on the whole thing. If you guys agree or disagree, leave those comments below. I want to hear them. You guys, the whole community wants to hear them. Give me your feedback, both sides of the story. I know some of you guys that are going to be watching this are going to have been affected in very negative ways by the Robinson helicopter. I hate seeing that. It's the nature, unfortunately, of what we do. We're in a risky business in the sense that things can go wrong, but it's the same thing in a vehicle. You can be driving on the highway and things can go wrong as well. So I'm sorry for those people, and but I want to hear you guys' feedback and your comments, so leave them in the comments below. And I'd love it if you guys shared this video. I think it's really valuable for anybody that's going to be flying a Robinson to hear this video and to see this video. Because I think lives can be saved if everybody's doing their part to educate and make sure people are flying these things within their regulations, within their specifications, and in the correct way, okay? I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please give this video a thumbs up. That helps me out so much. You guys can do such little things to help me out in such a big way, so I really do appreciate that. And until next time, you guys, we're going to talk to you later. See ya.